Well, good morning, West Portal. And if I may, just as a beginning, welcome back, and thanks for coming back. That's last week we had an invasive and a fairly personal passage, and anytime you wind up with the text that begins, "Wives, submit to your husbands," you feel yourself walking a little bit out into a minefield, but it's good stuff. We wrestled hard. I feel like we worked hard to bring some perspective to that, and we're going to build on that a little bit today. I'm keenly aware that the passage we looked at last Sunday has been used to oppress in particular women. One of the things I didn't say last Sunday, but just as a way of kind of, as an intro here this morning, any husband that's ever felt the need to resort to the expression, "woman, submit," I believe on really good, solid biblical grounds from the same passage can be responded to with, "man, die." So you can just kind of file that away for future reference. We're going to build on some of this today. We did a fair amount of kind of heavy lifting, laying the groundwork and kind of working with context last week. And because we're in this kind of household code section of Ephesians, much of that context is applicable to where we get today. But just as a way of retracing a little bit of our steps, people are coming to faith in Jesus. This is in the city of Ephesus in particular, although this letter may have been circulated beyond that. It's a very patriarchal culture and context. People coming to faith are implicitly asking, what does it mean to be shaped as and into this new humanity under the care and the leadership of Jesus? And in particular, what might this look like in some of these really practical relational areas of life, marriages and families and the workplace and so on. Now, the Roman world, as we acknowledged, would have the building block for society, they would have said, was the family unit. So the more structured and stable and dependable the family unit, the more stable and structured and dependable society as a whole, the empire as a whole, would function as. And it's into that context that the Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote these, they're called household codes. It's kind of like, here's the relational criteria of how relationships function well in these settings. And his was essentially, husbands rule your wives, fathers rule your children, and masters rule your slaves. This is just the way things were. And Paul brings the gospel of Jesus to bear on the culture and the context of his day. And what he says, while it sounds oppressive to us with the language, kind of through our 21st century lens, was surprisingly subversive and liberating in that context. Now, as we get to kind of this whole section about families today, let me remind you, the umbrella verse for all of these kind of sections is Ephesians 5:21. Everything that follows for marriages, for families, and for the workplace needs to be heard under the umbrella of Ephesians 5:21, which in short form in the NIV says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." And the way the NIV renders this is as a command. It's actually not in the original. I don't want to nitpick, but the only command in that particular section in chapter 5 is be filled with the Spirit. And so and this submission is a result of it, by which I just want to remind us, as you and I find ourselves under the influence of God's Spirit, when God's Spirit grabs a hold of human hearts and human lives, one of the ways this starts to play out is that we start to discover we can extend the kind of love that we've received to those around us. It's the result of that Spirit filling. We need kind of supernatural resources for it. We will not do this well on our own. We won't sustain it with our best efforts of psyching ourselves up. We need God's Spirit to be doing this kind of transformative work in us for it to move through us. Submit to one another out of reverence, out of respect, out of awe for the love that you and I have received from Jesus. This is the motivating point that allows us, actually James was just referring to, I think it's Ephesians 5 verse 1 and 2, right? Be imitators of God, or mimic God as dearly loved children, and live a life of love just as Christ loved us, and the word is, gave himself. It is, God's love is inherently a self-giving, sacrificial love, and because of the love that you and I have received, we can dare to think about what it means to love other people in and through this kind of a model. The other thing that's just worth retracing steps for is the word submission in the Greek is a compound word that is literally means standing under. By which I mean, this kind of submission is not coercive. It is not a top-down. It's not a submission that one imposes on the other. It is an invitation for everyone to consider what it means to voluntarily stand under the other. In our culture and context, and this wouldn't have been radically different in Jesus' time either, but we have a tendency to think that the way to get ahead, or the way, even relationally, to get people to do what we want, it's kind of the selfish framework we run things through, is to step on or to climb over or to push down. That's not this kind of submission. This is a voluntary standing under. It is a building up and a laying down of one's rights. So we need to keep this kind of broad culture and context in mind. Let's actually just look at our verses here this morning. Why don't you read these with me? We only have 4 to get through. So, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Now, short verses. We won't be short on things to talk about. Last week we had to say, the reality is not everybody is married. But all of us are kids. In some capacity. This is something all of us have in common. And the reality of marriages and of family units, the people that we live in close proximity with, is inevitably they both see and experience both the best and the worst of us. It's just the reality of relationships done up close. And I want to acknowledge, I don't know what your experience of family has been. And we come to a text like last week, like wives submit to your husbands. It's only the starting point. But we come to this. Children, obey your parents. I don't know what emotion this triggers for you. And it may trigger some distress or even trauma, depending on your particular story and your experience of parents. Some of you have had great parents. Some of you have not. None of our parents have been perfect, but some of you genuinely have not. You've experienced abandonment or isolation. Some of you have experienced abuse and emotional withdrawal. You grew up in an environment where it was implicitly or explicitly said you would never be good enough, you weren't worth anything. There was a culture and a generation that felt, I think, somehow to avoid promoting pride in their children, that they would raise them in an environment where words of affirmation and I love yous were generally withheld, that these would be seen as negative. So I don't know what this triggers for you. I'm just kind of wanting to table it. And say, whatever the emotional reaction you have to these verses, I would plead with you, as I did last Sunday, try to set the emotional response that you have to the side long enough, give me 30 minutes to try to just give you some perspective on these verses. I think there's good news here. And if you still feel the way you do afterwards, and this isn't intended to diminish your experience, but to help us bring our experience and see it through the lens of this text. Now, with that said, a little bit about context. So culturally, we've acknowledged this is a very patriarchal culture. However offensive you might have found, the first century's treatment of women, children almost certainly had it worse. Children were possessions. They were property. You could do with them as you wanted. Many would be raised not dissimilar to that of a slave. And just by way of example, infanticide was tremendously common in the ancient world. In fact, did you know it didn't become a crime? You could abandon your child to the elements for them to die. It was not a crime until 374 AD, which is roughly 300 years after this passage was written. I was reading an article this past week that it was some of the early Christians who were noted for actually going to the garbage dump to kind of root through it to see if they could find any abandoned children that they could consider adopting and raising. This is the background of this kind of a passage, okay? Now, into this culture, let me just talk for a minute about the example of Jesus. I am very guilty of reading past the kind of stories that we bump into in Matthew 19. Matthew 19, people are bringing their children to Jesus. And I read that and go, of course they are. Not the case. This would be unusual in that culture and context, and we know it's unusual because the response of Jesus' disciples is included in the text. And the response is this sense of kind of, let me paraphrase for you. To the children, it's shoo, scram, get away from here. And to the parents, it's implicitly, what are you thinking? This guy's time is valuable. He's on about important stuff here. Grab your rugrats and stop bugging him. Stop wasting his time. And that's where Jesus' response in the first century is actually really astonishing. Jesus has to kind of gently chastise and correct his disciples. No, let the children come to me because the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. This is a really radical word in the first century. Now, Paul is picking up this kind of Jesus-centered idea when he begins, children, obey your parents. Now, here's where I want to say again, you and I hear children obey your parents or wives submit to your husbands as the starting point, and the gut reaction is Paul is perpetuating the patriarchy and just upholding existing authority structures. Like, can we please move on to the armor of God and talk about something good and valuable? And no, you have to try to hear this in the first century context. Paul speaks directly to those who are most vulnerable, and he addresses and invites a response. Now, think for a minute what this implies. Children, obey your parents implies Paul assumed that kids would be in the audience when this letter was read in churches. That families would come with kids to worship and to open the Word of God, to hear it together. Not a given. That kids would be included is already a progressive idea. That he would speak to them directly and implicitly, again, hear this in context, Paul is looking at kids essentially and saying this, children, because of the selfless, self-giving love that you have experienced from Jesus, I want you to consider what it means to voluntarily stand under your parents as part of your love and your response. It treats them with tremendous dignity, tremendous value. It invites them to participate in this mutual submission as equals. The proper way that Paul should have written this is, fathers, tell your children to submit to you, or rule your children. Very, very dignifying language. We just need to hear it through that kind of a framework. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean the text isn't still invasive. And so I want to use the framework I did last Sunday to talk a little bit about what we'll just call, remember, this is about being filled with the Spirit and what this looks like spilling over into relational areas. So what do Spirit-filled families, in this case, look like? And there's two roles or two kind of ideas that kids can bring and live into to contribute to this story, and I'll talk about two things for parents as well. For children, Spirit-filled families, what do you bring to that equation? And what Paul has to say here turns and hinges on the word honor. Honor your parents. If you aren't aware of this, by the way, Paul is picking up the fifth of the famous 10 commandments found in your Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 20, if you're curious. Honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is going to give to you. The Hebrew word for honor has a wide range of meanings, but its primary, the heartbeat behind it is actually to make something heavy or to treat something as weighty, which seems odd, but if I was going to paraphrase it, I'd say, children, you are called and invited to respect and appreciate the weightiness, the tremendous responsibility that your parents have and that God has entrusted them with. Parents carry a heavy load. James was acknowledging that already. We are tasked with caring for God's most vulnerable creatures. Well, watch a mother holding a newborn baby, and you have this powerful sense of how vulnerable children are. Parents are responsible for protecting, for feeding, for clothing. Your child's primary sense of stability, of self-worth, of their image of themselves, of how they will learn to understand the world around them and take their place in it, character formation, skill development, their knowledge and awareness of who God is. And by the way, every parent enters this job arena as a rookie. Nobody gets to be a parent because of how much experience you have on your resume. You enter this with no experience, and because each of your children are as unique and colorful and challenging as you are, not only do you enter this as a rookie, you discover what works with one doesn't work with the next, and you're adapting and flexing and the whole way through. Kids, you have no idea the energy, the creative discernment, the emotional anxiety, and the sleepless nights that you have, and in many cases continue to cause your parents. Don't feel sorry for them, but honor them. Respect the powerful weight of the responsibility that God has put on their shoulders. And certainly in part, you can do that by ensuring your attitude and your posture and your words don't make their responsibility any more exhausting, taxing, thankless than it already is. Honor your parents. Respect the responsibility. They answer to God for this. Anytime that you find yourself thinking, my parents don't know Jack, or what if they're, and some parents are a bad example, but understand this, they don't ultimately answer to you, they answer to God one day for that. And I think there's something freeing in that. Honor your parents, respect their responsibility. The other piece that Paul just picks up and layers together with this is this obedience. Obey your parents in the Lord. Now, I've acknowledged this is the fifth of the famous 10 Commandments. When we read the 10 Commandments, we tend to bracket them into two categories. And usually we take the first four, I won't rehash them here, and we go, the first four capture the idea of what it means for you and I to love God. And then we take the second, not quite the half, but we take the last six, and we go, this is really what it looks like lived out, and this is how we love our neighbor as ourself, is kind of the bracketing. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. I just found the following piece of information this week. Interesting, so I'll share it with you. Jewish tradition has it. This is not scripture, grain of salt, okay? But Jewish tradition has it that Moses came down the mountain with 2 tablets, and each one had 5 commandments written on it. Now, not scriptural, but that means from a Jewish perspective, the 5th commandment, honor your parents, doesn't fall into the category of how do I love my neighbor as myself. It actually is understood as falling into the category of this is practically how I demonstrate and live out my love for God. It's a really interesting frame of reference, that God has placed your parents in a very God-like, a word on that in a moment, but in a very God-like role in your life. And part of the way that you and I get to honor and demonstrate practically our love for God is by obeying and honoring those that God has put in places of responsibility over us. How do you love the invisible God you cannot see? In part, the answer is you can do it by loving the parents that you can. Now, let's avoid a couple of wrong turns here. I said last week as well, when we get to passages for the husband is the head of the wife, or submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Your husband is not the Lord. Please don't push the analogy into that place. In the same way, your parents are not God. I'm not saying that. Honor and respect your parents, not because they are God, but because of your love for God. And the other thing I would just say is a wrong turn we need to avoid. When we come to a passage like obey your parents, the logical question is like, in everything? No. And here's where I feel I'm on good grounds to come back and say, Jesus, I want to say, clearly would have upheld the 5th commandment. And Jesus in Matthew chapter 10 says, anyone who loves their father and mother more than me isn't worthy of me. And it sounds like he's undercutting something that he would otherwise support. All of us, I read the following this week, I'll say it this way. The first commandment, love the Lord your God, is always first. Which means you and I have a primary obedience and loyalty and allegiance to Jesus. And that doesn't and shouldn't ever be compromised. And there are places where living this out in our horizontal relationships, there may be a conflict. And when there is a conflict in those places, this one needs to always come first. So obey your parents in everything? No, some discretion might be appropriate to apply. Nor can, and this is a short passage, and I'm going to say this probably more than once, Paul is not offering a pastoral commentary on every relational situation that we experience and encounter. And relationships are complex. They're complex between husbands and wives. They are complex between parents and children. I get it. He is giving us a vision of what this can look like when this is lived out with this Spirit-infused power. So it's a filter we can run our situations through, but it doesn't give us examples. So don't use this passage like, if there are situations of abuse and degradation, is this saying you have to stay in those? No, you cannot make the passage say something like that. There's going to be a common sense element we need to bring to this equation. Does that make sense? All right. Spirit-filled families for kids. Honor your parents, respect their responsibility, and obey your parents as you're able. This is in part how you demonstrate your love for God. Now, Paul has words for parents too. This invitation to voluntarily, and that's a really weird thought, voluntarily stand under your kids. But that's the language of this passage, right? Paul begins with actually a negative word. Don't provoke your kids to anger. Really interesting. In that culture and context, you would expect that Paul would start with an encouragement to exercise authority. But he doesn't. He begins actually by inviting a restraint of the understood authority. Don't provoke your kids to anger. If I was going to state this positively, I would say, parents, your responsibility is to foster a culture and an environment in your home that is both self-controlled and gentle. That to me is kind of the antithesis of a culture that's fueled by provoking to anger. And I don't know, there's all sorts of untold things that will provoke anger in the children. If you have a family environment that is not nurturing, that is not encouraging, where love is not expressed, your kids are going to be frustrated and struggle in the midst of that. If you have an environment where parents are really coercive and manipulative and always kind of forcing and railroading their kids into something that feels like it's not them, you're going to provoke your kids to anger. You will certainly provoke your kids to anger if you find that as parents, you are using their achievements and their success to prop you up and make you look good. Living vicariously through your children. You can watch this, by the way, in particular, I think in our 21st century context. You can watch parents who it looks like are deriving their self-worth through the achievements of their children, and they're driving them to some really unhealthy places as a way of doing this, right? And ultimately, you will provoke your kids to anger if you model it. I think 9 times out of 10, these kinds of volatile outbursts, emotionally, verbally, physically, is learned behavior. I would tell you this is found in Ephesians chapter 7. Yes, you should catch that as a joke. Monkey see, you know where this goes. I said, Ephesians chapter 7, you can look it up. It's a little addendum to Paul's letter. Anger is a learned behavior. You model this, they're going to pick it up. Don't provoke your kids to anger. Foster a culture, an environment that is self-controlled, that is gentle, where words are used to, remember, this is standing under. Words are used to build up. You don't have to coerce. You can lay down rights as a way of inviting your kids to succeed and to thrive. The other piece that's stated positively here is make every effort. Bring them up is what it is. Bring them up, the Greek literally means to nourish or to feed them in the training and the instruction, depending on your translation, the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. I used the language last week, in particular, with the kind of voluntary standing under role that husbands are invited to have. And I said, the motivation behind this is your desire is to help make this woman everything God designed and created her to be. And I think that same framework works really well as an invitation for how parents are invited to come alongside their children. What can you do that helps your child grow to be and become everything God designed and wired him or her to be? Now, that little piece of the Lord does add something to this equation. You and I pour ourselves out often for hours. I mean, just wrestling on the living room floor or playing cars, or whether you're teaching your kid how to do math homework or to write a paragraph for an English assignment, or you're teaching them how to kick a soccer ball or shoot a hockey puck or cook in the kitchen. We pour countless hours into shaping, in particular, the skills and the development of our children in the hopes that they will be able to one day kind of live independent of us. That's really the heartbeat behind this, that they can find and take their place in the world. I think the question inherent in this passage is, are we as intentional with the faith formation of our children as we are with so many of these other skills and attributes? I found myself thinking, COVID, it kind of shut down the ability to gather in person. One of the unique, or the impact pieces, I don't think this was entirely unhealthy. It wasn't flattering often, but it held up a mirror in some ways. When you cannot gather in person on a Sunday morning like this, one of the questions that it forced people to have to wrestle with is, what does spiritual formation look like in my life if I can't define it as going to church? What other habits and rhythms are nourishing me spiritually? And I think for some that maybe was a difficult question to answer. And I think it did something similar for parents, because the question it kind of pushed is, what does shaping the spiritual formation of my children look like if I can't define it exclusively as dropping them off to Sunday school? Right? You can kind of feel, and for many of us, that was an awkward conversation to have. Now, as parents, friends, you can delegate aspects of this. Don't get me wrong. There is a role for things like Sunday school and youth group and kids clubs, and for some of you, my parents invested in private school for me during my high school years. I'm not sorry about it. That's not really a right or wrong thing. There are aspects of this you can delegate, but you also have to feel the weight of this. There is nothing and nobody that can ever take your place as the primary influencers and the primary contributors to the spiritual formation of your kids. Your kids' spiritual formation will be picked up, I actually think, first and foremost, by just watching how much you love Jesus. Do they see mom and dad in their Bibles? Do they see mom and dad praying? They will pick it up. Their spiritual formation will be shaped in large part by the environment of your marriage. We were saying last Sunday that God's heartbeat behind marriage is a prophetic and provocative witness. It is to be a visible, tangible expression of God's self-giving love lived out between two people as a sermon to the world. Do you want to know who sits in the front row of that sermon Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all of the non-Sunday days? Your children. How does mom treat dad? How does dad treat mom? Is the environment self-controlled? Is it gentle? Are words used to build up? Do you see this mutual submission, this working to bring out the best in each other? No parent and no marriage is perfect. Just understand, you are preaching on a weekly basis with no intentionality. Your kids are watching. And there's not a shortage of ways you can bring devotional rhythms and whatever into your family. And I get it, every stage of life is unique, every dynamic family-wise and with your kids is unique. I'll just say, in the same way that imparting any kind of a skill to your kids, there's no substitute for intentionality and time. It always is going to take those two things. And I don't share this to make you feel guilty this morning. That's actually truly not my heartbeat. It's just that deep-seated sense that you and I have this powerful responsibility to live into and to step up into. And you and I can kind of feel the weight of that together. Don't provoke your kids to anger. And friends, nobody else can take that place, that primary spiritually formative place in their lives like you and I can. There would be some wrong turns to avoid here. I'm trying to think I'm going to actually try to end on time. That never happens, but I will do it this morning. One wrong turn just to avoid, and this is to my point about not feeling guilty. Proverbs 22:6 is often a guilt trip for many parents. Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it." And people often feel a tremendous weight if their kids don't make a choice to follow Jesus. I'm going to say two things, and you have to somehow hold these in tension. A, to the degree that we shirk our responsibility as those primary shapers of the spiritual formation of our kids, there's going to be a degree of disappointment that we should feel. And having said that, each of your kids is independent, and ultimately they make that choice between them and God. There are plenty of kids who have grown up in profoundly ungodly homes who have chosen to follow Jesus. There are plenty of kids who have grown up in profoundly, beautifully godly Christian homes who have chosen not to embrace and walk the faith of their parents. At the end of the day, you need to feel the weight of your responsibility, and the ultimate outcome of this has to somehow rest with God. Proverbs, by the way, it is a proverb not because it is an absolute truth, but because it is a truism. This is how Proverbs work. We word them in an absolute sense because we understand they're true more often than not. Kids pick up what's important to their parents. I largely can tell you that my love and investment and passion for music has come because of the family I grew up in. For some of you will have learned like electrical skills or how to change oil in a car or how to cook certain meals. We learn these things from our parents. Faith is no different. So the proverb has something to say, but it is not a universal truth. It's a truism. And there will be exceptions to that. And you will need to release that as you and I need to also release our kids to the care of Jesus at some point also. I could say some words about discipline. I will not go there this morning. Let me move to application. And application is fairly short. I'm going to just paraphrase, but I'll use the questions I used last week. I didn't intend to do that, but in my prep, I just feel like these are broad enough umbrellas that you can wrestle to apply these in and through your context. So children, and all of us are children, by the way, just a reminder. This is a category that actually pertains to all of us. And I get it. If you're 8 or 12, this looks very different than if you're 15 or 18. And this looks very different than if you're 45 or 65. I get it. Different chapters, different scenarios, okay? But children, are your parents thriving because of you or learning to thrive in spite of you? What's the attitude that we bring to that relationship? Are our words calming? Are they inflammatory? By the way, and James referenced this, and I do think those teenage years are often just the perfect storm because you have two really God-given desires in a perfect world working on both sides, right? Kids have this God-given desire to want to grow in their independence. And ultimately, as parents, we want them to be able to handle life without us. So you have this God-given desire that's pushing for more and more freedom and less control. And as parents, you have this heartbeat because you know the consequences of the kind of decisions your kids can start to make in these years can have long-standing implications. We have this tremendous heart and desire to go, I don't know if you're ready for this. I don't know if you're ready for this. And it's the perfect storm. Are your kids thriving because of you or in spite of you? What kind of attitude, posture, behavior? And by the way, kids, I'll just say this. I get it. Your parents aren't perfect. Some of you actually have not good examples of this. I get it. But we're invited to honor and obey our parents, not because of how worthy they are, but because of our love for Jesus. It's a different motivation. It's a different driver. Parents, are your children thriving? And here I'll add spiritually because that seems to be part of the crux of this passage. Are your children thriving and spiritually because of you, or are they learning to do this in spite of you or outside of you? What example are they seeing from you? What example do they watch between you and your spouse? What intentionality are you bringing to this, like many of the other skills and attributes that we work to pour into their lives? And by the way, here's where I say, and I get it, not every kid is voluntarily standing under dream. Okay? Some of you kids have not great parents. Some of you parents have not great kids. This is just tabling this, okay? Right? Some of your kids are rangy and rebellious, and they're not interested in you, and they're not interested in listening to you, and it doesn't let you off the hook. By the way, like I'm for what it looks like to still take the posture of Jesus in the midst of the challenge of the relationship. What does it look like to voluntarily stand under and come alongside in ways that invite and draw out or work to do that the best in our kids? And it'll be as unique as each of your situations happens to be. Let me leave you with this. I stumbled across this. This is from a Portland-based pastor. Said, the task of the church will never be to prove the claims of the biblical story. The task of the church is to become a picture of the dignifying, abundant life within the biblical story. Your marriages preach God's love. And I feel like if it's true of our marriages, it's just so true of our families. Your family is designed to be and become a picture of the dignifying, life-giving story of Jesus. And by the way, mutual submission, I was just thinking, as invasive as these words are, and as challenging as they are to live out, I get it. Maybe I'm unique. I hear these and you catch a picture of what this would look like if both parties brought this to the table. I'm convinced it's beautiful. You're like, it would work. But the curse of mutual submission is nobody wants to be the first. I'll do it if, and it doesn't work that way. So I'd leave you with the challenge I left you with last Sunday. I dare you. Take 30 days. Wake up each morning and ask yourself this question contextually as a kid or contextually as a parent. Are my parents, are my children thriving because of me or in spite of me? What would it look like to love them selflessly and sacrificially today? Do it without making a list. Do it without keeping score. Don't expect anything in return and watch what it does. Because I'm actually convinced the way of Jesus is good news, and it actually brings life to relationships. It just goes against every natural, sinful, selfish, hardwiring inclination that we have. We need a new operating system. That's why we need that Spirit filling to do it. But I'm convinced it's good news. Let's pray. Jesus, this morning we say once again, thank you for your great love for us, a love that walked away from heaven, a love that chose a path of poverty and of humility and of that sacrificial self-giving. And you did it not to lord it over us. You are worthy and sovereign, and you would be right to do that. And that's not the way you exercise your lordship and your leadership with us. You invite us to respond to you. I think Paul wrote this letter. Those opening 3 chapters are so impractical, but I think he did it on purpose. Those opening 3 chapters are this overwhelming picture of how great your love for us is. And as that starts to grab a hold of our hearts, we can start to think about finding that courage to dare to love those around us and those in closest proximity to us with the same kind of love that we've received. So Jesus, may your Holy Spirit continue to grab and arrest our hearts with that jaw-dropping love that we've received. Give us that kind of compassionate, soft heart to be willing to look and see others around us as opportunities for us to demonstrate practically our love for you poured out on these people. And Jesus, I ask that our families, our marriages, and our church, that this would start to preach a gospel that is captivating and interesting to coworkers and to friends that we rub shoulders with at school and to our neighbors, that this would tell your story in ways that would have other people going, I just want to see more about what this Jesus is about. So give us grace and courage to that end. We say, thank you. Amen.